Welcome to episode 132 of Shomar Gatekeeper, and my distinguished guest today is Ambassador David Friedman, who served as ambassador to Israel in the Trump administration. Hello, Ambassador Friedman, and thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, Gadi. Thanks for having me.
You are going to take part in the השמרנות, the conservative conference, not just take part, but the center that you founded, the Center for Peace Through Strength, is actually co-sponsoring this conference that would take place in Jerusalem on the 26th of this month. What is your connection to the conference?
Well, what I try to do with the Friedman Center is not to compete with other organizations that are doing good work, and we try to operate on a very low budget and operate as strategically as we can. So what we try to do is to partner with existing organizations or NGOs or conferences where we think that we can, amplify the message, add value, in a way where, sometimes, 1 + 1 can equal 3. Try to add, and so in that context, I've been exposed for years to the Tikva Center, to its leadership, and I really like what they're doing. And I thought that because the conservative principles that are being advanced in this conference, many of them have their roots in America. I thought that I could join as a co-sponsor, help to make the conference as good as possible, add my own thinking, add the thinking of other Americans who I had a relationship with, who I thought we could bring along, and to make it really a special conference where, the principles of conservatism, which, don't have a long history of development in Israel. Israel is one of those very few countries, maybe the only country in the world, where the younger you get, the more conservative you get, the older you get, sometimes the more liberal you get. No one else, I don't think there's any other country in the world that's like that. And so because the establishment was founded on principles that I don't think anybody would consider conservative, I'm happy to kind of help Israel along, and at least in developing, the thinking about conservative principles. It's a democracy, and whatever the people of Israel decide for themselves, I would of course respect. But I think we have the ability to really aid in the discourse and to help, I think, bring some of the thought, the political thought, to Israel that America thrived on for many generations.
In Israel, it's a well-established opinion in our discourse that conservatism, the conservatism that we now speak of, originated in America. But it's been your view that there was a fundamental Jewish influence on American ideas. What are these ideas that influenced the American culture?
Well, look, I think that what made America at its roots a great country was the Declaration of Independence, and what was said in the Declaration of Independence that was unique is that human rights, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and other human rights, that they weren't granted by the sovereign, they weren't granted by the government, they were granted by God. And when all of a sudden human rights become endowed by our Creator, in the words of our founders, they're no longer negotiable. They're not, they're permanent, they're immutable. And so that's what I think got America off to the right start and a different beginning than other countries, that human beings were, it didn't matter whether you agreed with them or not, whatever, it didn't matter what their religion was, it didn't matter. I mean, obviously America the first 100 years were very complicated with issues of racism, but the general notion was that human beings were endowed with, immutable human rights. And as that principle evolved over time, I think it's really what contributed to the greatness of America. And I think that that's exportable, to other countries as well, those principles. And then, of course, there's ideas about, transparency and personal accountability and responsibility. That that people ultimately are responsible. The government is not responsible for what I become. I'm responsible for what I become. The government should help. The government should always do what it can to promote personal responsibility and advancement and prosperity. But the ultimate responsibility with what becomes of a human being lies with that human being. It lies with that person's parents, with their family, with their own local environment. And as we say, our founder said many times, the government that governs least governs best. And those principles, I think, again, are good principles that have enduring value, and I think something that Israel should consider as well.
There is always a almost logical problem with conservatism when a country emerged from a revolutionary tradition. So the American conservatives, it's hard to be Edmund Burke. I'm quoting Lewis Hartz here. It's hard to be Edmund Burke when your tradition is John Locke, or when your tradition, because in Europe, John Locke and Edmund Burke are two opposing poles. While in America, as you've said, Edmund Burke was John Locke's ideas of human rights in their Jeffersonian variation were at the founding of America. Is conservatism in America still plagued by such a contradiction, do you think?
I think to some extent. I think we're not really we're a 250-year-old country that I think we are what we are at this point, and I don't think there's going to be much shifting. But look, we're still battling in America, and I think it's emerging. It emerged now primarily, so, to a certain extent because of COVID, to a certain extent because we have a huge disparity of wealth in America, as I think Israel has as well. We're going back to flirting with certain socialist principles, but at the end of the day, I think we have a formula that works, and we'll hopefully be able to keep it and expose it and export it to others as well.
Does that mean you're optimistic about the midterms? Because there's been an apocalyptic mood. I just came off reading a book called The Stakes by Michael Anton, and this is I encountered that mood on the American right. It's a mood of doom. It's the elite classes has monopolized everything from social media to bureaucracy to the news, and it's just imposing a Marxist agenda on America. Do you share that pessimism, or do I detect optimism in your tone?
I'm not quite as gloomy. I haven't read Michael's book. I know him. I worked with him when I was in government, and I'm looking forward to hearing his views. Look, we went through a period, and I think we're, maybe with the purchase of Twitter by Elon Musk, we'll start to see a reversal of that. But we went through a period where, we still have people very, we're a lot of Republicans are still looking back to 2020 and trying to figure out what happened. Now, I'm not one of those. I'm a lawyer by training, so I only make conclusions based on evidence. So I'm not one of those guys who is still trying to prove that the election was fraudulent. But I don't think there's any question that large social media companies interfered inappropriately with the election. I mean, the fact that, when you have the complete shutdown of any social media information on Hunter Biden, and then you find out that 15-20% of the voters would have cared about that and might have changed their vote. So, and then when you find out, a year and a half after the election, that the premise for shutting down that story, that it was false, was itself false, that it was actually a true story, and the media determined that they were going to decide it was false, and they were going to deprive the voters. Look, I mean, democracy is only really as good as the intelligence of its voters, right? I mean, it doesn't. If the voters don't have the information, they're not able to make good decisions. So that's a real issue, and I share the the concern about that. I'm pretty optimistic about the midterms. Nothing's a sure thing. I think that the biggest issue in America right now is to get our social media, our communications system right. We got overtaken by the dominance of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. I don't think anybody really understood while it was going on what it would become, and now we have so much information upon which people make critical decisions. It's in the control of the private sector. So that's a real issue, and maybe we'll see Twitter evolve into a much more free and open and transparent environment. That's what Elon Musk is saying, and if that happens, I think that'll be great. But the elections themselves, I think, are going to move in the right direction.
Hopefully, I wrote about the Hunter Biden story. Whoever wanted to know knew. So if you would make the effort, you could know. And I wrote about it here, and there were calls to shut me down in Haaretz. I was a conspiracy theorist, and the whole. So it's the same here, and we too are looking up to Elon Musk now. Although it's still in the private sector, at least it would be a little more balanced. Let's talk a little bit about your tenure as ambassador. Even before that, your part in the Trump campaign and in formulating Trump's Middle East and especially Israel-focused policy. How would you define first in the most general terms the way the Trump administration and you approached the question of peace and the question of Israeli-American relations?
So, most people kind of describe that as, that I was, extremely right-wing to the right of Netanyahu, and they completely missed the point. My view about the U.S.-Israel relationship is that it needs to grow up. America needs to treat Israel like an adult, not like a client state. And that ultimately the most important point is that Israelis, not Americans, but Israelis know best what's best for Israel. That was my premise. In other words, I've always been willing to respect the view of the Israeli people and the democracy of Israel. People think I'm trying to push Israel to the right. I'm not looking to push Israel to the right. Israel happens to be a center-right country. What I'm trying to do is to enable the Israeli democracy to act for itself, to express its own views. And people, I think, have always misunderstood my views. I mean, my own personal political views, yes, of course, are to the right, but my job is not to substitute my view. I don't live in Israel. I mean, I'm here often now. I'm here, many months during the year, but I'm not an Israeli citizen. I don't send my kids to the army, and I don't view it as my right at all to tell Israelis what to do. But I think it is my right to tell the American government that they ought to allow Israel to make its own decisions for itself and to respect those decisions as we would respect the decision of any other democracy with which we have this kind of a relationship.
So the relations between America and Israel, when you came into office, or when Trump came into office, were at one of the lowest points. There have been low points before, and we tend to forget them. The United States participated in the weapons embargo on Israel in 48. Eisenhower was very, hostile, maybe a too strong a word, but was willing to detach American policy from any consideration of Israel in the aftermath of the Suez crisis. And then came Obama. And I think Obama is, I often said this, in my view, it's my interpretation, this is the first Edward Said educated president of America. And in a deep sense, like my friend Caroline Glick says often, even anti-American, but certainly anti-Israel. Yep. What did you find when you came into office, and how did you go about fixing it?
Well, I agree with you, by the way. And I think that's one of the few things that Obama and I share in common. We both took the class of Edward Said when we were at Columbia, so he probably enjoyed it more than I did. But I wanted to hear it myself. The relationship was broken. Really broken. That's the way I saw it when we came in. Hence the metaphorical reference to a sledgehammer, the need to break the connection and to reset it. Primarily, it was, but this is true of Obama, but it's also true of other prior presidents, including Republicans to some extent. A sense that Israel is a problem. It's basically Israel is a problem. It creates trouble for America. It puts America at odds with countries that are in its strategic interest to be aligned with.
Biden actually said it when he was vice president. He said America's problem in the Middle East is its allies. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, and that's exactly right. It's exactly the way they thought. That Israel was a problem. It put America at risk from a security perspective. It put America at risk from an economic perspective. But that it was kind of this. There was this large group of people in America who loved Israel, whether because they saw Israel as the answer to the Holocaust, whether they saw Israel as a democracy, whether they were Jewish and they were proud, whether they were evangelical Christians and they saw Israel as being the beginning of the redemption, whatever they saw. So politically, you couldn't be that tough on Israel, but you had to manage it because it was a problem. So you had to manage this geopolitical problem in a way that didn't get you politically into trouble. And that was, I think, a Republican and a Democrat approach, for, I would say, the majority of the administrations since 1948. We came in and said, you know what? It's not a problem. I mean, the whole premise is wrong. Number one, we don't care about all the oil in these countries. We're going to become energy independent. We never again want to depend upon oil in the Gulf. So we're going to care less about that. That's number one. Number two, we don't think that being pro-Israel is all that offensive to the Saudis or the Emiratis or the Bahrainis or the Qatar or Kuwait. We don't think they really care that much. We think they've got a historical bias, but at the end of the day, they have bigger problems, and we're in a position to address some of those problems. And so, the whole premise that being pro-Israel puts you at risk in the Gulf, we don't think that's even right. And the third thing is that, Israel is a major first world country with extraordinary opportunities for coordination and cooperation with America. Israel has eyes on threats in the Middle East that in some respects are better than America. Israel is a technological powerhouse. Israel is a cyber powerhouse. Israel, is a commercial, powerhouse. It's got more companies on NASDAQ than any country other than Canada. So obviously in America. So it's the opportunities to be close to Israel, we saw it as greatly outweigh the risks. In fact, we didn't really see any risks because of how our conversations in the region. Look, President Trump went to Saudi Arabia in 2017. It was his first foreign stop. He goes there, he meets with 54, Muslim countries. And he says to them, look, you got to give up on this idea that Israel's going away. Just give up. It's a fantasy. Forget about it. But you know what? Here's what you got to worry about. You got to worry about radical extremism because it's going to destroy every one of you. And number three, we will partner with you, but we're looking to you to eliminate radical Muslim extremism before it crosses the Atlantic Ocean and we have to deal with it. So the president set down a very clear message. On the one hand, we could be a great friend. Number two, but you have to be accountable for what's going on here, and you have to give up on this idea that Israel is going to go away. And frankly, you don't want Israel to go away, because if Israel goes away, you're going to end up with a much greater threat emanating from this area than you have now. And they all knew it already. I mean, this isn't something like these countries didn't know it, but we were able to surface this idea, make it palatable for people to discuss it, make it less toxic. And I think that's, and the first thing we did that showed us that we're on the right track is when the president made his announcement to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and nobody cared. Nobody cared. And that's what we thought would happen. We couldn't prove it, but we thought, based upon all the intel and all the conversations, nobody cared. Because at the end of the day,
there was a media campaign here on the left, since the left controls the mainstream media, that the Middle East would explode all over, and nothing happened.
Yeah, look, we were watching the intel for a month. I mean, really carefully looking at it, and I would have a conversation with people in our own government, and and the CIA, and I say, what's going to happen? And they say, oh, the world's going to explode. And I say, why? And they say, well, because this is very controversial. I said, is that all you got? I mean, I know it's controversial. Tell me something I don't know. Tell me what are you seeing? What's going to happen? No. Everyone assumed that the world would explode because they've always assumed that the world would explode. But when I pressed for any real evidence that any real threat, and look, we have the best intelligence agencies in the world, show me a real threat. Nothing there. And so
why these are people, they are sold out to the Obama view. That's the reason that they kept this going.
Don't underestimate the power of conventional wisdom. The power of, people just think the way they do because they've always thought the way they did, and that's why all the great, that's why frankly Israel has so many technological advancements. Israel's one of the Israeli people are probably their best quality. Some might say their most difficult quality, but their best quality is they don't accept the status quo. They don't accept conventional wisdom. They push the envelope, and they think out of the box. And
that's because we have no box. You can't make three Israelis stand in a line to a box because everyone. I just got a question. I don't know. This is like an idiom in Israeli Hebrew of how there once were long lines in Kupat Cholim to go to the doctor. So everyone is just has a question. The rules, Israelis believe in rules. They just each think of themselves as the exception. So that's how it works.
So that's a challenge, for government and for governance. But it's a good thing when it comes to coming up with new technologies and cures for diseases. And also, frankly, it's it's very good for the Army and the intelligence services to constantly be questioning. America is not so good at that, and that's again goes back to the whole title of the book of Sledgehammer: the importance of just breaking with the past and saying, you know what, we're not going to accept any conventional wisdom unless you can reprove it today that it's still true. Everything is on the table for reevaluation, and that was one of the best things of the Trump administration. He gave us the opportunity to challenge all conventional wisdom.
When you guys came into office, and we were informed that you would work out a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, many of us said, "Oh no, not again! There is no solution." And then there were those who said, "Well, professional diplomats have been at it for 100 years or so, and here's a group of people. One of them, yourself, is a bankruptcy lawyer. Jason Greenblatt, also a lawyer, right? Trump, a businessman, and they're going to get into this intricate problem, and they will come up with a solution. And lo and behold, it was almost done." In the end, is it true that Israel was the obstacle? Let me make this point clear, because it was a fight for me. Because when this was announced, personally, I was overjoyed, and I said, "Look, this is going to enable us to implement our sovereignty on Bikat HaYarden, on the Jordan River Valley, in a framework that will be internationally called a peace plan." So I assume the Palestinian would say no to everything. But then the Israeli right erupted, or the settlers erupted in resistance, because it contained the idea or the phrase a Palestinian state. So I'm jumping the gun here on many issues. Maybe I should just ask you how it came about, and if you think there was a missed opportunity there.
Well, so we'll start with how it came about. President told us from the beginning, this is the most intractable conflict in the world. I want you to solve it because that's what I want to do. I want to solve unsolvable problems. So we worked on it, and I'll tell you, for a while, I shared your view that it wasn't worth the effort because we weren't going to solve it. The Palestinians weren't going to agree to anything. I would come back and forth to DC from here, and I just said to the president, "Look, whatever impressions you may have of Abu Mazen when he meets with you and he acts all respectful, I'm telling you, if you remember, the summer of 2017 when when two police officers were killed guarding the Har HaBayit, and then, they found out that the weapons had come from inside the mosque, and then they shut down the mosque, and then they wanted to put in metal detectors. And the whole place erupted. And I was watching, I thought that the Palestinians acted terribly, terribly. They took this, they used this as an advantage just to create violence and to create leverage, and more people were killed as a result of that. When what happened? There was a murder by a Palestinian terrorist from inside the mosque. They should be apologizing, not making demands about what Israel should do. So I went back, and after that I went back and I told the president, look, this guy's not, he's never going to come to the table on terms we can agree with. And by the way, that doesn't even answer the question about Hamas, which is half the problem, and they're never going to make any kind of a deal on any terms that doesn't include Israel's destruction. So I managed his expectations that it's never going to happen. Then the question was, what do we do? So Jared and Jason wanted to keep going. And I originally said, well, why? Why are we doing this for? It's not going to lead us anywhere. But then as I saw sort of the opportunity to write a plan that would that could endure at least as a data point in this entire history, where which would have the support of the Israeli government and have the support of the Israeli security, the entire security team. I showed this thing to everybody from the Shabak to the IDF intelligence to the areas. They loved it. They said, this is the only plan that meets our security needs. I said, well, if we could write something that Israel could live with and explain why, if we can get the support of the Israeli government, and if we could demonstrate that Israel, under some circumstances, they may not be acceptable to the Palestinians, but under some circumstances is willing to actually part with some of the territory that it captured in 1967. Very few countries give back land after they capture it in a defensive war. So to show that Israel has this willingness to negotiate and to compromise, and if we can, so the whole issue of a state, it was very difficult for me to swallow. But I've said this before, and I said this after. It was a brand. It wasn't the real state. It was, okay, if the Palestinians want to call it a state, that's fine. But they're not going to control their borders. They're not going to control their airspace. They're not going to control their electromagnetic spectrum. And Israel is going to have complete freedom, unrestricted freedom of operation for security. Not the hot pursuit doctrine that was that Israel would fight for and maybe not even get from America, but whatever. Israel has full freedom of operation inside of the territories, including Area A, which they don't have now, right? At least not under Oslo. So I said, I can live with that. Plus, it's an opportunity to remind everyone about Yitzhak Rabin's vision, right? Because Yitzhak Rabin, gave his life for for Oslo and for peace, and he's become the patron saint of the peace movement. But Yitzhak Rabin, his views are not the views of the left today. Yitzhak Rabin got up and said to the Knesset, I envision that the Palestinians will have less than a state, and Jews will have a significant presence in Yudav Shomron. Okay, that's not,
and the Jordan Valley,
and the Jordan Valley, of course. That would be that he would never go up the Jordan Valley. So that's the patron saint of peace. And today, I don't think he would recognize today the peace movement that adopts his name. They're all Rabinists, but they don't realize that that's not where he was. So I thought this was a good opportunity, to publish a plan, also to make the point that, the United States should not be putting its fingerprint on a Palestinian state of any kind if they continue to be have no system of justice, no financial transparency, no religious freedom, no human rights. So it's a good way to, because ultimately that'll take years and years before the Palestinians are able to develop that. They first have to get rid of Hamas, which is another, which may never happen. So I thought this was a good aspirational way to put a peace plan out. Now, in terms of your question, why did the sovereignty not happen? It's all in my book, but it's a combination of things. And I'll just tell you, some of the things. Some of the things are the far right didn't support the plan at all. The far right said, give us the sovereignty, but we're throwing out everything else. So that right away made it, was a difficult argument to make, because the United States is putting out a peace plan. Part of that is Israel will be able to obtain sovereignty, but part of it is that Israel will negotiate the remaining provisions of it. So when the right says we don't want it, and we only want what we like, and we don't want what we don't like, and of course they are then also politicking to the U.S. evangelicals, the same thing.
It's the triumph of symbolism over political pragmatism. It's a true tragedy. Yeah.
And then you have other things happening, right? You have a Israeli government where the three leaders are Netanyahu as the prime minister, but then Gantz and Ashkenazi as the defense minister and the foreign minister. And 2 out of the 3 are not in favor of this. They're not. And they're not. Now, could they have gotten there? They might have gotten there if they could have resolved their other issues. In other words, if there would have been a 2-year budget passed so that Gantz and Ashkenazi have the security of knowing they're not going to be bounced out of office, they might have been more willing to get involved. But as it stood, because that wasn't on the table, they weren't likely to make an accommodation that would have made Netanyahu far more popular and done nothing for their politics. So the politics were all messed up. And then on top of that, he had COVID, right? And the whole world is shut down and people are upset. And the polling of the Israeli population was that far less than half were in favor now of going forward with the sovereignty because it's just enough things on their plate to deal with, enough problems. So lots of these things could have been resolved. By the way, I believe that we could have achieved the Abraham Accords as well had we kind of worked through with the Emirates the idea that, look, okay, you're uncomfortable with the sovereignty, you want it delayed, but let's have let's do a schedule. Let's do, in other words, it didn't have to be fully suspended. I'll never know the answer to that because we never tried that, but it might have been worth trying had there been more of a consensus position inside of Israel or inside the United States. I mean, as this all began to evolve, even the president was getting very negative on it because it was allowed to move off into different directions. There were too many points of view. And
where did Jared Kushner stand on all that?
So Jared, I think, was of the view that the opportunity for the Abraham Accords was so historical and so important that that if that was on the table, we would, and it required sovereignty being delayed. It was a clear choice. But by the way, I have to tell you, I mean, looking back, I agree with him because. At that time, the opportunity was great, and the risks of the sovereignty, just because the country was not behind it, America was not fully behind it. I mean, on a risk-adjusted basis, what's better? I mean, certainly now I'm advising the president. What's better for the president? It's not even close. At that point, the Abraham Accords were a far better outcome for the United States than to do a contested recognition of sovereignty, and so I think Jared's view was the right view.
One of the important things related to this agreement is that this agreement, this deal of the century, was a separate track, while for all previous administrations and for the Israeli left and for half the for all the anti-Zionist left in Europe too, and generally for the center too, it was an axiom that you have to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem before you can reach peace with any other Arab state. I'll just remark that I started believing in the deal of the century when I don't remember where it was stated, but that it contained the principle that whenever the Palestinians refuse something, next they will get less. Because for so many years, every time they refused, we came up with a better offer, and America encouraged us to come with a better offer. Yeah. And here comes a president who's a businessman and says, you don't negotiate that way. If you negotiate that way, you give them incentive to keep saying no.
Right. But yeah, look, I mean, one important provision, which I don't think people understood, was that Israel would, out of the box, would have half of Area C, right? With roughly 30% of Yudav Shemot, half of Area C, which included all the communities and some room to grow. It would not build in the other half for 4 years to give the Palestinians a chance to negotiate. But after those 4 years, all bets are off, and they can go take the rest of Area C. So yeah, the way it was structured was that, and every deal should be structured, that there is a risk to saying no. You don't give somebody, you don't. There's an expression where I come from. Never give anybody a free option. You have an option. You have to pay for every option. A free option is, okay, so I'll sit around and wait and decide. Nothing bad will happen. And that was the approach that was taken in the past. Look, you need actually a business-like approach here, because that's the way business gets done in the Middle East. They've never respected these American diplomats who come in and tell you in advance everything they're going to do, tell you in advance how they're going to react to everything, tell you in advance all their principles, and then, people make fun of them, and that's, I knew that from all the times that I've been involved in Israel and observed its politics. It's not, this is the Middle East. The Middle East is very different. You want to move forward, you got to be strong. You're not strong, you could die. I mean, that's the reality.
So saying no would have cost the Palestinians a price had the deal gone through, but also saying no would not jeopardize all the other tracks for diplomacy in the Middle East. And I think that probably the greatest achievement in American Middle East policy, maybe ever, is that an exaggeration? I don't know. Was to break the Arab veto on the Arab boycott on Israel and the Palestinian veto. How was that breakthrough achieved?
So that was something that I pushed for from the beginning. I said, we're the strongest and most powerful country on earth. We have an alliance with the state of Israel since its inception. They're an incredible partner. I've seen that when American troops are at risk in the region, the Israelis, they will wake people up in America at night and tell them, you have this risk, you have that risk, this could happen, that could happen. Israelis consider American life as almost as precious, maybe as precious as Israeli life. That's how good a friend Israel is to America. And I said, you know what? The Palestinians are just, they're an issue. They're not the only issue. They're not the most important issue, and they can't be the gating issue on moving forward. And again, going back to moving the embassy, we did that. We didn't ask permission. We understood that there would be a response. We said, look, Americans passed a law in 1995 to move their embassy to Jerusalem. It's the will of the American people. You guys are just not that important to get in the way of the American people. Then we went to Ramat HaGolan, and we didn't ask permission. And then we looked at the how America's policy on the communities in the Yudav Shomron, and we said, the State Department has a policy that they're against international law. Do we agree? We took a look at it. I met for months with lawyers there. It wasn't easy. I had to actually really work hard. This was where my legal training was helpful. But ultimately, we got the State Department, to reverse its view and conclude that the Jews have a right to live in Yudav Shomron. And we didn't ask for permission. And we did all those things. And you know what? Were the Palestinians upset? Yeah. But you know what? They didn't start a war. They didn't, they're much more violent now than they were then, because they knew that America would not restrain Israel from defending itself. And also, none of these other countries cared. They just don't. We're at a point now, and maybe we were lucky because we were here at the right time, or maybe it was just the strength of our positions. But our allies in the Gulf, some did it publicly, some have not yet done it publicly, but privately, they're not far away from the UAE and Bahrain. They realized that their national interests were more important to them than siding with the Palestinians, who were perpetually unreasonable and impossible. And when we were giving them the cover to begin to surface those types of relationships. And I think that you're 100% right. Getting rid of the Palestinian veto was the essential thing that we broke. We broke the headlock that the Palestinians had on the region. And I think everything else, good came from that. And it began with Jerusalem.
It also has to do a lot with the shift in the administration's Iran policy. Was that were the Abraham Accords explicitly debated when President Trump decided that he would leave the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran?
Look, they were that decision was applauded by the Emirates and the Saudis and Bahrainis, and they were very complimentary and happy about it. We didn't then turn around and say, okay, now that we did this, we want you to normalize with Israel. It didn't happen that in response to it, but I think it was part of the puzzle. There's why are the Israelis and the Emiratis on normalized relationships? Is it helpful to have a common enemy? Sure. I mean, the common enemy with Iran and the U.S. response to it was important. But there's a lot more. I mean, the commercial opportunities, the tourist opportunities, the alliances, the security sharing. I mean, so it was a whole package, and it evolved. But once we got out of the JCPOA, we were certainly on the right track. I mean, at that point we had enormous credibility with all our friends in the Gulf and with Israel as well. And of course, now that we're heading in a different direction, we're putting those relationships much more at risk. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, you're forcing the Saudis and the Emiratis to find a way maybe to coexist with Iran. And the Saudis and the Saudis and the Iranians are having meetings. Nothing good will come of that. I mean, nothing good for Israel will come of that. I mean, it's not what we want to see. But that's what happens when you put your allies at risk. They start looking at other options that don't include you, and here's where we are. So it's let's just hope that the Iranians will follow the footsteps of the Palestinians and miss the opportunity.
I like to end these shows on an optimistic note, but I'm afraid that might not be possible if we because I want to finish with Iran and the Biden administration and the fact that they have forbidden to call the Abraham Accords, mm-hmm. which is a big red light. Of course, are they really trying to undo them? Is it gone that far?
I don't think so. I mean, so I'll spare you the most pessimistic scenario. I don't think so. I think that would be politically unwise and diplomatically unwise. But what they're doing is certainly going to restrain the advancement of the Abraham Accords, and everybody's watching what they're doing with Iran. I think they would have been prepared to take the IRGC off the terror watch list. I think politically, they're hearing from too many people in their own party, too many Democratic senators. That's a bridge too far, and I think the Iranians are asking for assurances that a Republican president can't undo this, which I think is also very hard to get. So the Iranians seem to be finding a way to blow this, which I'm happy about. But the real question is this: are we going to go back to crippling sanctions against Iran and continue to make them pay for their view? I mean, people have said to me, "Why'd you get out of the JCPOA?" And now the Iranians are enriching uranium and they're moving towards a nuke. Isn't it better for them not to? My response was, it was never a deal. There was never a deal there. I mean, the Iranians prohibited inspectors from looking at their military sites. So where are they likely to cheat? On their military sites where they would develop weapons. So it was never a deal. And it did nothing about, ballistic missiles or fomenting terrorism. And they cheated, and they, their whole representation that they had no, aspirations for a nuclear weapon were shown to be a lie by the Mossad. So, we didn't give up anything by getting out of the JCPOA. The question is, how do we get the Iranians to stop becoming nuclearized? And the only way to do it is to really make them choose. You have to give them the stark choice. Do you want to be a nuclear nation, or and a bankrupt nation, or do you want to be a non-nuclear nation, that has an economy? That has to be the choice. They have to be in a position where if they opt for nukes, they also opt for bankruptcy. And we could get that. We could force that choice upon them. The question is, will Biden do that? Because that's the only way to solve this problem.
If a Republican, let's close with something that at least I consider optimistic. If a Republican administration comes after the Biden administration, and if you are hopefully part of it, how would it approach the Middle East after Biden?
Look, we would. It's no surprises here. We would impose the most crippling sanctions on Iran, and enable the United States and Israel. And Israel would need a lot more, I think, a lot more than it has now. Enable Israel to defend against a nuclear weapon as early as possible in the cycle of the development of that weapon. Meaning, if the Iranians just say, "Fine, we're gonna tough it out, accept the sanctions, and just go out and building a weapon on the model of North Korea," we would all make sure that the ability to slow that down dramatically exists in the capacity of both Israel and America. That's the only way to establish deterrence, is because a lot of people will always doubt whether America will act. I think fewer people will doubt whether Israel will act, and so deterrence is critical through enabling Israel with the weapons.
So if it was up to you, an American military option is also on the table.
It is, but it would be for me. I will tell you, I'm probably not in the majority even of the Republican Party, but I think the Republican Party would view it to be important to enable Israel to have a military option. And I think that would be something the Iranians would fear, because it's a real option. I mean, it's much more likely, I think, that Israel, given the capability, if it had the capabilities and the right strategic, tactical means of doing so, I think Israel would be the much more likely actor. So we need to make sure Israel can act and support them in their acting. Separately, look, we would take that peace plan, we dust it off, we take it off the table, we'd go back to the sovereignty movement, because the sovereignty, nobody agreed to cancel it. It was just agreed to be suspended. We were backing off as the suspension would be over. The time for the suspension will be over. And we would go back and continue to socialize it. And we try to, work with our friends in the Gulf, get more parties to the Abraham Accords. I think we'd get the Saudis. I think we'd make some progress even with Kuwait and Qatar. I mean, it's possible. I think we could make some progress in Indonesia. I mean, there's all kinds of openings that could be possible for us, even Pakistan. So, we would work really hard and we would tell the Palestinians, look, we think you have the right to live in peace and dignity. We want you to prosper. We want you to have a better life for your children and your grandchildren. But your demands are exorbitant. They're never going to be met. Why don't we sit down with some of your friends and work something out? And we have to end Hamas. I mean, there's nothing to talk about if Hamas is running a militia that every time they don't like what's happening, they're going to start firing rockets. So we need to figure that out, and we obviously need to enlist the Egyptians, and America needs to have better relations with Egypt too. I mean, ever since Morsi was taken out of power, the Obama administration treated Egypt very poorly. I think we were much better, but now, Biden's back to, treating Egypt in a way that I don't think they deserve. I think al-Sisi's done an enormous good to stabilize the region, and we need to work with him again. So we would do everything. We'd do almost everything differently. I mean, whatever he's doing, just reverse it, and that would be our policy.
Amen. I hope we would see that day. Ambassador Friedman, those who want to hear more from you can do so on the השמרנות, the conservative conference in Jerusalem in the 26th of May, where you will be speaking. Thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the show.
Thank you, Gadi. Pleasure being with you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.